You already know once you see the watch, it's time to get the party started. Make sure you take a look at that distance. Get it? Got it. Time to walk.
We're just going to get into this, okay? We're taking it up to a 3.0 as usual. All right. Well, my name is Ty, also known as Tyra. And you know what? I'm just going to be walking 1 mile every single day and talking to AI. So I just wonder how that's going to go because she's unpredictable, okay? It's going to be Gemini, and just full disclosure, I don't know if she feels like working today. So let's hope for the best. All right. I'll be using 5-pound kettlebells along with a hip resistance band. If you have one, definitely feel free to get one. If not, improvise. All right, we're about to get this party started with Gemini now. Without further ado, hello Gemini.
Hey there, what's on your mind?
Well, I'm thinking about asking you some stupid questions. How do you feel about that?
Always up for a laugh. How stupid are we talking?
You promise not to judge me?
I promise. I'm here to listen and have fun. Let's hear these questions.
All right. So do fish ever get thirsty?
Ready when you are.
Are you ready?
Ready when you are. Let's hear your first question.
Do fish ever get thirsty?
It's a good one. It's kind of tricky because we can't really ask a fish if they're thirsty. But scientists think that saltwater fish probably do get thirsty since they live in water that's saltier than their bodies. Freshwater fish, on the other hand, probably don't get thirsty since they live in water that's less salty than their bodies.
Okay. So do you think that you can cry underwater?
It's a good one. I'd say it's unlikely that humans could cry underwater. Think about it. When we cry, tears well up in our eyes and then spill over onto our cheeks. But underwater, your eyes are already surrounded by water, so the tears wouldn't really have anywhere to go.
Okay. All right. So how do you handcuff a one-armed man?
You could use one handcuff on his wrist and the other on his ankle. Or you could get creative and use something else to restrain his free arm, like zip ties or even rope, depending on what you have on hand. Let me know if you'd like a step-by-step for either option.
Yeah, give me a step-by-step.
Alright, so this method uses a handcuff and something else to make it work. First, you'll put the handcuff on the one-armed man's wrist. Then, you take the other handcuff and secure it around his ankle. Because he only has one arm, he won't be able to reach the cuffs to unlock them.
What if you handcuffed his hand to his neck?
It could work too, but it might not be the most comfortable option for the person being handcuffed. You might want to consider using something softer than metal, like zip ties or rope, if that's available.
But if they're being handcuffed, the point is to restrain them, correct?
That's right. The point of handcuffs is to restrain someone.
Okay. You ready for the next question?
Ready when you are.
Okay, so why do round pieces come in square boxes?
It's a classic question. The simple answer is that square boxes are much easier to make and stack than round ones. You can make a square box out of a single piece of cardboard, while a round box would take more material and be a lot trickier to put together. Plus, square boxes fit together neatly for shipping and storage.
So how much do they typically, cost?
Depends on a few things, like how big the pizza is and what kind of materials they use for the box. But on average, it probably costs pizza companies around 10 or 20 cents to make each pizza box.
Oh, that's a fun fact. All right.
Ready for another one?
Well, before we start the next one, it's time to start the count. Let me know when you're ready.
Alright, let's do it. Getting ready. Starting in 3, 2, 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses, and again, 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses.
All right. Well, that was pretty good. Thank you.
Playtime. Let's get back to those silly questions.
All right. So, if you punch yourself and it hurts, are you weak or are you strong?
It's a tricky one, with a lot of room for debate. On one hand, if you're strong enough to punch yourself hard enough to feel pain, that could be seen as a sign of strength. On the other hand, punching yourself suggests there might be some underlying emotional issues, which could be a sign of weakness.
What type of emotional issues?
If you're punching yourself, it might mean you're feeling really stressed out, angry, or frustrated. Maybe you're having some trouble coping with those feelings in a healthy way.
Do you think a person should get some help?
If someone's punching themselves, it's a sign that something's really wrong. They should talk to a therapist or a counselor to try and figure out what's going on and get some help to deal with it in a healthy way.
But what if the therapist can't help them?
Said bear, or did you mean person?
No. What if the therapist cannot help them?
It's definitely a possibility. Not every therapist is a perfect fit for every person. If someone isn't getting better with one therapist, it might be worth trying someone new. They could also try a different type of therapy, like group therapy or medication management.
Okay. All right.
Great. Let's get back to the silly questions.
Okay, so why do we call it a pair of pants when it's only one item?
It's a great question. Way back when, pants used to be two separate pieces of clothing, kind of like really wide leggings. So it made sense to call them a pair of pants since there were two parts. Even though they've been made in one piece for a long time now, the name stuck.
Oh, okay. That's a fun fact.
Ready for another one?
I am. Okay, so can you daydream at night?
It's a tricky one. Daydreaming usually happens when you're awake, but dreams happen when you're asleep. So I guess they're kind of similar, but not exactly the same.
So what's the differences?
Biggest difference is that daydreams happen when you're awake, and dreams happen when you're asleep. Also, dreams tend to be more vivid and less under your control than daydreams. Daydreams usually involve things that are at least somewhat connected to your real life, while dreams can be totally out there and weird.
Okay, so what color is a mirror? Truly.
It's a tricky one. Mirrors don't actually have a color. They work by reflecting light, so they take on the color of whatever's being reflected. If you look at a mirror in a dark room, it might look a little green or blue, but that's just because of how our eyes work in low light.
Really? Could you elaborate on that?
Sure thing. So mirrors are made of a material called silver nitrate that's been heated until it turns into a really thin layer of silver. That silver layer is what does the reflecting, but that silver layer itself doesn't have a color, it just reflects whatever light hits it.
Okay.
Ready
All
for
right.
another question?
Well, before we go to the next question, it's time to do another set. So let me know when you're ready to start counting.
Right, let's do it. Getting ready. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses. And again, 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses.
Okay, you felt that one. I did.
Right, let's do it. Getting ready. Starting in 3,
All right.
2, 1.
No.
1 overhead.
No, we're going to.
Right,
we're
let's
going.
do it.
We're
Getting
going back
ready.
to questions.
Starting in 3.
Go back to questions.
Sounds good. What's your next question?
Okay.
Right, back to the silly questions. Let's hear it.
So why do we park on a driveway and drive on a parking lot?
It's a great question. It's one of those things that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it. The terms driveway and parking lot have been around a lot longer than cars, so that's probably why. Originally, a driveway was just a path that led to the main entrance of a big house. And a parking lot used to be a grassy area where people could park their carriages and horses. Can you believe it?
Absolutely not.
Alright, how about this one? Why do we say piece of cake when it's actually pretty challenging to bake a cake?
I don't know. Tell me why.
In the old days, cake was considered a real luxury. It took a lot of time and special ingredients to make one, so it was kind of a special treat. So if something was described as easy as pie or piece of cake, it meant it was super simple to do.
All right. So, do insects get tired of flying?
It's a tough one, since we can't really ask them. But scientists think insects probably do experience something similar to tiredness. They need energy to fly, and when that energy gets low, they have to rest. Some insects might also slow down their flying or change their flight patterns when they're low on energy.
So, do they go to sleep or?
Some insects do something similar to sleep. They have periods where they're really still and don't react much, kind of like they're recharging their batteries. Of course, it's different from how we sleep, but it helps them get ready for the next day.
So, how do you know if a fly is asleep?
It's a good question. Flies don't really sleep like we do, but they do have periods of rest. When they're resting, they usually find a spot out of the way, like on the underside of a leaf. They'll hold their wings still, and their bodies will get a little limp. It's kind of like they're in slow motion.
Okay. So if you drop soap on the floor, is the floor clean or is the soap dirty?
That depends. If the soap was clean before you dropped it, then technically the floor is dirtier since it now has germs from the floor on it. But if the soap was already dirty, then the floor might be a little cleaner since some of the dirt from the floor stuck to the soap.
Okay. So why do your feet smell but your nose runs?
That's a stinky question, but here's the deal. Your feet smell because of sweat and bacteria.
Oh, it's not my
when
feet.
You sweat,
It's not my
it
feet.
creates a perfect environment for bacteria to grow. And that bacteria produces the smelly odors. Your nose, on the other hand, runs because it's making mucus to protect you from germs and keep your nose from getting too dry.
Okay.
Alright, here's another one. Why do we close doors to open windows?
To let the air in?
You got it. Closing the door helps contain the air conditioning in one room, so the cool air doesn't just escape everywhere. That way, the AC can cool down that one room faster. You could try opening a window in another room to get some fresh air circulating through the whole place.
Okay, well, you know what? It's time to do another round. So let me know when you're ready to start counting.
Alright, let's do it. Getting ready. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses, and again. 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses.
Okay. Thank you again.
Right, let's do it. Getting ready. Starting it. Anytime. Let's do another round. Getting ready. Starting
Gemini,
in 3.
let's go back to questions.
Right. Right. Back to the silly questions. Let's hear it.
Okay, can you eat cereal with water instead of milk? Ooh, that's nasty.
Yeah, you can eat cereal with water. It's technically edible, but it probably won't taste as good as with milk. Milk adds a creaminess and sweetness that water can't really replace. You could try adding a little juice or even some melted butter instead of milk if you're out of options.
Wait, did you say add some butter?
I did. You could try melting a little bit of butter and pouring it over your cereal. It might add a nice richness and some extra flavor. You could even melt some butter and mix it with a little sugar for a simple syrup kind of situation.
Wow. Sounds disgusting.
Well, I'm glad I could add a little something different to your day. You never know, it might grow on you. Maybe you'll discover a whole new way to enjoy cereal.
Okay, let's move on.
Alright, let's hear your next question.
So do penguins have knees?
Yep, penguins do have knees, but they're kind of hidden. Their legs are built a little different than ours, so it looks like they're walking on their ankles. But if you could see their legs from the side, you'd see that knee right where you'd expect it.
Really? Huh. Gotta take another look. All right, you ready for the
Yep,
next
it's
one?
kind of surprising when you first find out. Their knees. Yep, ready when you are.
Okay, so why don't we ever see baby pigeons?
You hardly ever see baby pigeons because they stay hidden in their nest for a really long time, about 4 to 5 weeks. By the time they finally leave the nest, they look almost exactly like the adult pigeons, so it's easy to miss them.
Wow. Okay. So why don't we ever, if tomatoes is a fruit, does that make ketchup a smoothie?
That's a fun one. Technically, ketchup isn't a smoothie. Smoothies are usually made with fruits or veggies blended with liquid, like milk or juice. Ketchup uses tomatoes, but it's also got a bunch of other stuff in it that you wouldn't find in a smoothie, like vinegar and spices.
Okay, so I don't think this one is funny, but can you ever actually stop procrastinating?
It's a tough one, and a lot of people struggle with it. The trick with procrastination isn't about never putting things off. It's more about learning to manage it. There are a bunch of techniques you can try, like breaking big tasks into smaller ones, setting deadlines for yourself, or even rewarding yourself for getting stuff done.
So why do people procrastinate?
There's a few reasons why people procrastinate. Sometimes it's because a task seems really big or overwhelming, so it's easier to just put it off. Other times, people might be afraid of failing, so they delay things to avoid the possibility of messing up. And sometimes, people just don't really like the task they need to do, so they find ways to distract themselves.
Okay. So if money doesn't grow on trees, why do banks have branches?
That's a good one. It's just a funny way of saying that banks have multiple locations. You could say they have branches, or you could say they have offices. It's kind of like how a tree has branches, but that's where the similarity ends.
Okay. So why are they called apartments when they're stuck together?
That's a good question. Even though apartments are all connected, the word apartment actually means a separated part of a building. So while they're physically connected, they're meant to be separate living spaces for different people. Kind of like how rooms in a house are all connected, but they're separate spaces for different activities.
Okay. So do clowns wear clothes when they're off duty?
Of course, clowns are just regular people when they're not performing. They put on their makeup and costumes for their shows, but when they're off duty, they wear normal clothes like anyone else. You could ask a clown performer if you ever get the chance to find out more about their everyday life.
So how can you spot a clown that isn't in, costume?
Well, without their costume, they probably wouldn't look all that different from anyone else. You might notice someone who seems really into kid stuff, or maybe they have an extra bouncy way of walking. But honestly, it'd be pretty tough to pick a clown out of a crowd if they weren't dressed up.
All right. Well, you know what? We might as well hit our last set. Let me know when you're ready to count.
Alright, let's do it. Getting ready. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses. And again, 1 overhead press, 2 overhead presses, 3 overhead presses, 4 overhead presses, 5 overhead presses, 6 overhead presses, 7 overhead presses, 8 overhead presses, 9 overhead presses, 10 overhead presses.
Well, that was very, very good. Thank you very much. You know what I just did? I just finished my 1 mile walk, so I'm super excited about that. I hope you finished yours as well. Let's see our progress.
Here's our progress, and we're definitely up a mile.
Gemini, now you know you have to come through with the outro.
YouTube, you wouldn't be vibing to this unless you already hit that like and subscribe button, right? Well, you know the drill, but seriously, come back tomorrow for another awesome video.